Hello everyone, welcome back to our YouTube channel, and uh, we are coming back after a while, and there was one topic that Prisha wanted to discuss with us, and that's very close to her heart, which is mandatory conscription. So we'll try to listen to her views, and towards the end, we'll try to summarize whether mandatory conscription in India is feasible, or what are the impacts, or what are the negative impacts, pros and cons, basically. So Prisha, mandatory conscription is basically when young people are required by the law to serve in the military, or let's say take part in the national service for a brief period. But before we get into all these details, let's set the stage. Why is this such an important topic to talk about? Why did you say that it is like very close to her or your heart? So what makes it relevant today, and how does it tie it into the India's unique context?
Yes, hi Arpit. So basically, mandatory conscription has historically been implemented to ensure that all able-bodied citizens uh, they rise to the occasion of national defense,
Right.
and mandatory conscription is also seen as a tool that instills unity, patriotism, discipline among citizens. Uh, and talking about history and just talking about history, so mandatory conscription has historically been implemented by countries during trying times when like there was an emergency or a need arose or any nation was facing some significant challenges.
Okay.
Now talking about India, so Article 23 of the Indian Constitution does have a provision for mandatory conscription. However, India has never implemented or enforced this, even during trying times like wars with China and Pakistan. And given Indian constitution's just emphasis on personal liberty, it is also highly unlikely that India will enforce this unless like an extraordinary need arises. And as for the need, even that is highly improbable because India already has over 1.4 million army personnel. So India has a very strong defense force. And also again, mandatory conscription is one issue that has baffled thinkers and divided opinion for over centuries.
Mhm.
So philosophers like Rousseau and Machiavelli, they supported conscription because they thought that it fostered a sense of civic responsibility and national loyalty. But if we talk about the critics, they didn't included prominent economists like Adam Smith, who
Mhm.
felt that mandatory conscription goes against the principles of specialization and competitive advantage.
Mhm.
So it is probably this division of opinion over this issue that makes it so very fascinating from a policy standpoint and also makes it very relevant despite there being a very slim chance of India ever implementing it.
Okay. So thanks for throwing light on the relevance of mandatory conscription, and especially briefing the audience about the Article 23 and the counter intuitive, I would rather say, the Constitution focus on the liberty. But since this podcast is all about exploring the less talked about the aspects of conscription, I think it's fair to first set the stage by briefly discussing the more common pros and cons, like as you had already started setting it up. That way, we can give the audience a solid foundation before we dive deeper. So, what do you think are the key advantages and disadvantages of introducing mandatory conscription?
Uh, okay, I think I couldn't agree more, Arpit. So let's just discuss some of the most widely stated pros and cons of this policy before we dive into like more finer aspects of this policy issue. So talking about the pros, it definitely it it strengthens national defense because it basically builds like a trained reserve pool of personnel who can be used at the time of an emergency.
Right.
Secondly, it instills, as we had previously discussed, instills a sense of patriotism and unity among citizens. Then it also helps develop critical skills like leadership, teamwork, discipline, all of that. And finally, it also supports public welfare programs like disaster management and infrastructure, and also in this process helps provide exposure and skills for marginalized communities. Now talking about the cons, so it leads to delays in workforce entry, which then in turn leads to economic losses. Then it is also seen as an attack on personal liberty, and we'll obviously deep dive into this particular aspect like in a little while.
Okay.
And it could also lead to mental health issues such as due to stress and just separation from family. And finally, it also faces a lot of implementation challenges due to high administrative and economic costs. Uh, and also, I would just like to give a disclaimer before we move ahead. So, these pros and cons that I just stated, these are not my personal views, and I might not fully agree with them. They are just very widely stated pros and cons of mandatory conscription. And while there may be some truth in them, uh, and also they might hold more weight in some societies, throughout our conversation and the duration of this podcast, we might actually end up testing or challenging some of these commonly held views. So just wanted to state that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So thanks for enlightening us about the pros and cons, the bullet points, basically, I would rather say, of the mandatory conscription. What will be the pros and what will be the cons? So it is like on the other side. So it's often said that the mandatory military service brings more discipline to the society, and it also helps develop better leaders. But I can't help wondering, would a regimented military-like society actually be desirable? Is it truly livable? While military life undoubtedly instills valuable life skills and soft skills, would it also negatively impact the other aspects of society?
uh, I think that's a very thoughtful question, Arpit, and I think it really sets the stage for a very important and critical discussion. So while there's no denying the fact that uh, military instills important skills like discipline and leadership, imagining a society that operates with that level of structure, uh, it raises some very important concerns like would the society become more orderly, or would creativity and individuality suffer? What happens to arts, literature, cultural expression, and in the face of conformity? And also, like, would we move towards like a stronger society or a more dystopian one? So here's my take on it. I feel that creativity and individuality will definitely take the backseat in a hyper structured society. And also, arts, literature, and cultural expressions might also suffer because they thrive on freedom and experimentation, which a very regimented society might not permit.
Right.
And for the same reasons, it might also diminish in innovation and might discourage entrepreneurship and free thought. And also, while this kind of a structure might instill a sense of collective responsibility among citizens, it will definitely come at the cost of pursuing personal ambitions or personal goals. So yeah, that is what I think about this issue. Yeah.
So now in this podcast, we are moving more towards finding out a right balance, probably. So that's what you were trying to tell, like how creativity and individuality may be taking a back seat. So it's always a trade-off between a stronger society or a dystopian one, as you mentioned. So coming from the citizens' point of view, should citizens be obligated to serve their country by virtue of their citizenship? Or should the concept of mandatory service, whether it is military or any other service, be considered a misplaced expectation in a democracy? Like, should services like healthcare, education, or disaster management be voluntary choices? Or is there a role for mandatory service in addressing national challenges? What is your take on it?
I think this particular question, it strikes at the very heart of this policy issue. So
Mhm.
more than economic considerations, more than infrastructure challenges, more than fostering a sense of national unity and national civic responsibility, I think I think this, for me at least, this forms like the crux of the policy issue. So more than just practicalities, it is about whether a nation can mandate mandatory conscription
mm,
while honoring democratic freedoms. So, like if I have to say, if I have to mention a couple of points against mandatory conscription, then it would be, uh, it would be that it definitely curtails freedom of choice. So, at the core of democratic values is the right to choose. So, technically, citizens should decide in what ways they want to contribute to the society. Second is economic consideration. So citizens already contribute to the society through their work, through taxes, and through civic engagement. So imposing a mandatory conscription, be it military or any other civil service, it could be seen as be seen as redundant and inefficient, because especially because it diverts critical resources from critical needs. And then finally, ethical considerations. So forcing people into service roles, especially critical sectors like healthcare and education, it might lead to suboptimal outcomes, because individuals who are unwilling or unprepared for these roles, they might deliver poor quality services, and instead of like increasing or basically fostering an idea of civic responsibility, it might end up actually diminishing it. And to be fair, just to state like a few uh, points in favor of mandatory conscription, so it addresses critical shortages. So
mm,
there's no doubt about the fact that India faces some very critical challenges in essential sectors such as healthcare and education. So a structured mandatory service might help mobilize the youth to fill these gaps and ensure that these services reach the underprivileged sections of the society. And secondly, as we had already also previously discussed, that it instills a sense of civic responsibility and national unity, and a sense of nation being a collective, and all of us being a part of this collective.
mm,
So I mean, it ends up basically instilling a sense of national pride among citizens. But the debate about mandatory conscription isn't about uh, military service or mandatory civil service. It's about what it means to be a citizen. So
mm,
in today's time, there exists like a social contract between citizens and the state. The very basic idea is that citizens benefit from the state, but they also owe it something in return.
right.
So does mandatory conscription fall under this contract, or does it violate personal autonomy? It also raises some very ethical concerns, like should people who choose not to be a part of such a service be penalized? And
Right.
what about people who are physically or mentally challenged to contribute to this kind of a mandatory service? So, so, so the debate surrounding mandatory conscription is basically about balancing individual rights and and collective responsibility. So, it reminds me of this very famous quote by John F. Kennedy,
Mm,
which goes, "Ask not what the country has done for you, but ask what you can do for your country." But I think in the 21st century, it's equally pertinent to ask what exactly should the country do for you to expect something in return,
mm,
and should it even expect anything in return, if anything more in return, if you're already a law-abiding citizen who pays their taxes on time.
mm, right. So we've been discussing on the mandatory conscription. It's such a hot topic, isn't it? I mean, there are so much, there are so many things, so many articles, books, videos, all debating on its pros and cons. But let's go a bit deeper. What happens when we look it through a more nuanced lens, thinking about the economic impacts, gender dynamics, and the broader social implications that probably we do not get to see, or we do not get to listen from a lot of people. Mostly, it's the nation's pride that is the focus in most of the videos that I have gone through. And also, like as you earlier mentioned, that while there are some widely accepted arguments on both sides, some of those might not hold up entirely. So can you shed some more light on that as well?
Sure, Arpit. I think that's a great question, because that it is at the heart of why mandatory conscription is such a complex policy issue. So, just to simplify it, we can think of mandatory conscription as like an in-kind tax, where governments they replace physical taxes with forced labor.
Right.
And this approach is often appeals to countries which are failing to raise revenues through taxes, or even to policymakers who are hesitant to basically increase physical taxes. Yeah.
Okay, so that's quite interesting, especially the idea that you mentioned about conscription as a tax. But isn't there an argument that conscription also fosters equity by making everyone serve equally?
I actually, Arpit, I think that's a very common misconception. So first, so to begin with, unlike a professional army that is funded through uh, physical contributions which are spread evenly across all taxpayers,
Hmm.
the burden of conscription falls unevenly on certain individuals,
Right.
and particularly males in their teens and early 20s.
Hmm.
So this because of this unequal distribution, it results in both gender-based and age-based inequalities. Then there are also countries like Denmark, Thailand, and Mexico that have mandatory conscription, and they basically select their draftees through a lottery system. So
Hmm.
again, it raises some ethical questions about just fairness and randomness.
Hmm.
And in fact, I'll probably just quote something from a research. So I'm forgetting the name, but I'll give due credits in the description. But basically, the research suggests that drafting middle-aged individuals into mandatory military service is actually it actually distributes social costs more fairly, uh, because young people are more vulnerable to psychological scars from wars, and
Right.
also older people might just handle reintegration into civilian life after serving in the military just better and more effectively.
Right.
And so again, I think coming back to your question, so advocates for conscription argue that it is a more budget friendly system and also like a more equitable system, but it merely shifts the financial burden to specific age groups and specific genders. So that.
So yeah, that's a valid point. But what about the economic consequences? Like, does conscription have any tangible impact on productivity or let's say the societal efficiency?
For sure, Arpit. So conscription basically disrupts resource allocation and career development. So young individuals are lose out on opportunities for just education and career progression, and it leads to and which in turn leads to economic losses. In fact, yeah, at the start of this podcast, I mentioned that Adam Smith, the famous economist, was a huge critic uh, uh, of this policy simply because it goes against the principles of specialization and competitive advantage.
Right.
So because it and 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 the reason for that is that basically specialization and competitive advantage are built on the idea that different individuals or nations have varying abilities and efficiencies in performing certain tasks.
Okay.
So basically this idea it leads to inefficient labor costs and economic losses, and also like inefficient labor matches. So so meanwhile, an involunteer military, like an all volunteer military,
Hmm.
despite its high physical upfront costs, it ensures that personnel are voluntarily recruited, they are adequately trained, and they're just better suited at their roles. So while a professional army can create distortions through taxes needed to finance it, these costs are more equitably distributed and avoid the hidden efficiencies which are inherent in a system like mandatory conscription. And
Okay.
also, so conscription, it also leads to substantial avoidance activities. So for example, during the Vietnam War in the United States, individual dodged mandatory military service by immigrating or engaging in marriages or pretending to pursue education.
Right.
So, and similarly in Russia, where conscription is also mandatory, I mean, there's also mandatory conscription. A lot of eligible men evaded these services through through measures like bribery or fake medical certificates or prolonged university enrollment. So, and also, as we had previously discussed in a little detail, conscription also risks prioritizing conformity over creativity and potentially stifling innovation and just cultural diversity. So, as we had previously discussed. So, that, yeah.
So all we can just hope is that the Agniveer scheme that is prevalent in India, hopefully, I mean, I'm not sure. I should say whether it could be converted to a mandatory conscription with some policy in place that does not impact the economy altogether. I mean, it's just my view, probably. I'm not sure how it will be decided by the policy makers in future, but that would be very interesting to watch in coming years, since there will be need of services coming into picture. So we just have to wait and see. So yeah, okay, Prisha, so that was a fantastic and unique perspective on the issue. So do you have any final thoughts or remarks to wrap up the discussion? I mean, yeah.
Mm, yes. So basically, mandatory conscription, it's not just a policy, but it's a reflection on a nation's values and also on a nation's priorities. So just to give you an example, so Israel is a very, very small country,
Hmm,
both by area and population.
correct.
And so Israel's highest priority is their survival as a nation,
Right.
and and that is why values like civic responsibility or patriotism and national unity, these are built into the very fabric of that country. So and mandatory conscription, it brings up important questions about personal freedom, diversity, and how feasible the system is. But for a country like India with its rich cultural diversity, the challenge really is just finding a balance between strengthening national defense and preserving individuality. So, in fact, one critical question that we all can ponder upon is that do we truly need more boots on the ground,
Right.
or should we shift our focus towards modernizing our defense systems and just prioritizing quality over sheer quantity? And Again, I'd like to end by again quoting a famous person. So Benjamin Franklin said that those who those who give up liberty for security deserve neither. So these words actually remind us that a society cannot sacrifice on personal freedoms in pursuit of national security,
Hmm,
and it's also sort of like a warning that in our quest for national security, we must not forget that we must not forget about the very freedoms that make up a democracy and basically make democracy what it is.
correct.
So yeah, just those are my final thoughts.
Yeah, so I think the last part that you mentioned, that prioritizing quality over the sheer quantity. So there have been several examples in the past. I mean, there have been examples in the World War One and Two as well, like where quality was the focus. And even in the recent times, if we see the Israel that invests a lot in modernizing their defense equipments and their defense systems. So I think, yeah, that's an important point that could be taken. To manage or to come up with a policy for the mandatory conscription, that there should be priority more towards modernizing the weapon system or the defense system. So yeah, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts today. And I would request all our viewers to share this video to every single person who feels that mandatory conscription is important, or others who feel mandatory conscription is not important. So please share this video with others. And also I would request you to comment what could be the next topic that we would probably take in our next video. So do comment and let us know. So thank you so much for listening to us. Thank you, Prisha, for sharing your thoughts. Hope to see you
Okay.
soon again. Yeah.
Bye.
Bye bye. Okay.